snake holes. We have four kinds of snakes in Alberta, and interestingly, in the winter, all of those snakes will go into a burrow together. So they'll find a burrow, usually a rabbit burrow, and they'll all go into this rabbit burrow and they'll all form a big ball. And in that ball, you'll have rattlesnakes, garter snakes, hognose snakes, and bull snakes, and they're all in together. And I think, once again, if you saw a burrow, you'd have no idea that it was a snake burrow or something that the snakes were using, rather than just being a rabbit burrow or something like that. And then other fossils to look for in the fossil record would be turtle tracks. And this is a nice turtle example here, where turtles come ashore and go back out to sea. And these tracks here are alligator tail traces. So this is my foot here for scale. And these are where an alligator has slipped into the water. It was kind of obviously hanging out close by the beach, or on actually on the edge of a lake. And as I came along, it's popped into the water and left this trace for me to take a picture of. And then I just put this one in because this is something, a nice behavioral trace. So this is something that we saw when we were on holiday in Arizona. And there were lizards everywhere running around. And we were looking at these lizards, and we were looking to see what their traces look like. And this is a lizard that was just walking along quite comfortably, back feet, front feet, back feet, front feet. And then it saw us and it panicked, and it just scarpered, it ran off into the distance, and left these very different traces behind. So you can imagine, if we looked at this in the fossil record in a sandstone, and we were looking at this, then having this modern information, we could say, oh yeah, we've seen that in Arizona. This is what happens when a lizard's startled. So that's the startle point where the lizard track changes. Going to move on to birds now. We're getting towards the end of the talk, but we still got some exciting things to go through. So first of all, I'm going to talk about Borneo. So when I was doing my PhD, without doubt, the most exciting day was the day that I found fossil bird footprints. And these are Miocene in age, and they are preserved in ironstone, cemented as ironstone. And this is the morphology of them. You can see that it looks like there was one or two birds walking in this direction. There are also these little round marks, which are probably prod marks, where the bird prodded its beak into the sediment to look for food. And there's some other unusual traces sitting in there that are hard to distinguish as well. But overall, very interesting to see these fossil footprints. And I was able to suggest that there's something like a plover, made by something like a plover. What I also found in these same beds were these weird zigzag traces. And you can see the zigzag trace moving backwards and forwards through the sediment. So I was trying to look at
the audio seems to have
find out what they were. And then I went on holiday to South Africa.
John,
and I was out. Yes,
John.
Yes.
If you go back, we lost all sound from you for about a minute or two.
Okay. You want me to go back to this one?
That's fine. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So associated. Is that good? Associated with the fossil footprints were these weird zigzag traces. So you see these zigzag traces here, going backwards and forwards across the sediment. And I did not know what they were. So I tried to look at some other zigzag traces from the geological record. There were some little burrows in deep marine conditions. These ones here, Bellaraphi, Paleomeandron. And then I saw some sawfly marks, which are crossing a leaf, but they really didn't tie into these marks in the sediment. So these marks are in fossil mangrove deposits. They're associated with bird footprints. I did not know what they were. So I was on holiday in South Africa. I used to live there, so I went back on holiday to visit. And I was running along, and I saw this bird, which is called a blacksmith plover, and it was feeding. So there were hippos all over the place, but this bird was feeding, and it was feeding by moving its beak through the sediment like this. So it was sweeping its beak backwards and forwards, much like avocets do as well, I found out afterwards. And these are some of the marks that it created, and they're not quite the same as our fossil record version, these ones, but they're pretty similar. So I think that these are actually some kind of weird bird feeding trace. So that's a fossil bird feeding trace, previously unreported, which I'm in the process of publishing up. So that led me to think about other bird feeding traces. So I've got some examples of bird feeding traces here. So this is herring gull, where the herring is dropping, these correspond to the picture on the right. So that's a herring gull dropping shells to break them. This is an ostrich feeding trace. These shells here were dropped by a kite. Also, the kite was dropping the shells to try and break them open, the snails open. Then we've got ducks dabbling and making dabble marks on a riverbed. Turkeys, this is a turkey lek, so similar to that dinosaur lek earlier. And then a raven dropping tortoises onto the ground to break the tortoise shells open. We've got a woodpecker pushing material into holes in the bark here to store nuts. And then we have an owl. So this trace here, this is a rabbit trace going along here. The rabbit's bouncing along, bottom right of those pictures. And then the owl has come down, whoomph, and grabbed the rabbit. So that's an owl feeding trace. So all of these, none of these are recognized in the fossil record. None of them have names in the fossil record, and all of them should be there. So we should be looking for those when we go out into the field. And then another type of trace that's very rarely seen in the fossil record is nests. And so this is my new branch of science, would be ornithology. So looking for fossil nests. And what got me onto this was that I saw this fossil, which is a tufa fossil. It's Pleistocene in age. And I wanted to buy it because it's such a beautiful thing with these eggs in the middle and a nest around them. It's got a fossil branch underneath as well. And unfortunately, it went for 18,000 euros. So I just have the picture for you. I don't have the real nest. I couldn't afford that. But there's all sorts of nests around the world. And I think this is another kind of fossil that we should be looking for in the fossil record. This is an eagle nest up here. So this would be a giant trace if you found that. If you found a mass of wood with a few skeletons in it, I don't think you'd be thinking nest. You'd probably be thinking, well, this was washed together in a flood. So really, once again, we need to have an open mind. So I've got a few other traces here as well. I'm lucky enough to live in this very snowy environment, and that means that there are a lot of nice traces that are preserved, and they're only temporarily preserved. So if you've got your camera out, then you can get some of these traces. So these are some examples. These are different kinds of footprints that are preserved in the snow. This is a bird that's coming into land. So its wings are just touching the snow as it comes into land. And then I've called these DLTs and GLTs. So this is a duck landing trace, DLT. And this is a goose landing trace. And this goose landing trace, it slides in. So it comes in, its feathers touch the ground, it skids to a halt, and then it goes and sits down here over here. So that's a goose landing trace there. And then another trace that's associated with geese, and this is really my favorite, is the goose resting trace. So we found these within about 200 yards of my house. You can see these rugby-shaped traces here. So there's the shape of the trace. They're about 2 feet long, 1.5 to 2 feet long, and they have a kind of a little appendage at one end. And what these are is goose resting traces. So the geese lay on there overnight, and the heat of their bodies melted a little depression in the ice, and they had their feet dangling out of the back, their webbed feet that were making the little mark there. So these are goose resting traces, or GRTs. And you do find dinosaur resting traces which have the same morphology. And this is an example from a paper that was published by Milan et al. Showing an interpreted dinosaur resting trace. So there's the ancient and there's the modern. So we're going to finish with mammals. And I'm going to talk about different types of mammals. This is an elephant footprint. And I actually slept in an elephant footprint when I went trekking in Namibia. And I was very excited I found this footprint and I slept in it. And then the next day, the guide said, "What do you think you were doing? Don't you realize that elephants, when they walk through an area, if they come back through there, they walk in the same place. So the last place you want to sleep is in an elephant footprint, because if it comes back again, it's going to tread on you for sure." So there are so many examples of mammal traces. I'm just only going to scratch the surface here. This is some examples. This is bear tracks from when we were out hiking. They look like kind of foreshortened human footprints, but with claws. We went on holiday and actually saw lion footprints on the road and followed the footprints to actually catch up with this lioness who was just strolling along in Botswana. We've got here, this is an example of where there's a bird here, but the bird ended up getting captured by another animal. I mean, I found the bird, similar examples of this, I found the poor bird actually lying dead at the side here, where it interacted with some kind of other animal that might have been a dog or a coyote or something like that. And then this is a nice classic Canadian trace for you with a beaver gnaw marks that you see here. Often you see where there's an animal that's being chased by something else. So these are rabbit tracks here. And then these are coyote tracks. And you can see the coyote is going along here. One of the coyotes kind of branches off. And I wonder whether it was close enough to the rabbit to actually chase after the rabbit. And that's why it changed course to follow in these rabbit marks here. I mean, they may have been days apart, but they may have been very close. And there's a famous example from Glen Rose in Texas that was discovered by Roland T. Bird. And there's a sauropod trackway here with these big prints, and then a theropod, a meat eater trackway here. And we don't know if they were walking at the same time. Was the theropod tracking the sauropod? Did it want to have long net for lunch? Or were they days apart? And you would only know if you tracked this and actually got to where the kill was. But unfortunately, I think that this trackway went into a cliff, so they were unable to go any further. So we'll never know. When I used to walk my daughter to school, we always used to stop by this park and see what tracks the squirrels had made. So this is a modern squirrel track, fresh, made that day. And this is the degraded track a few days later. And then this over here is what we call squirrel surfing, where the squirrel's in deep snow. So it's kind of leaping from forward, but each time it leaps forward, it's actually scraping its belly. So we called that the surfing squirrel. And then I did a search online for surfing squirrel, and I found that there are apparently actually real surfing squirrels. So who knew? So these weren't, this squirrel is obviously surfing in a marine setting, not in snow, but maybe there's some similarity there as well. And then we're going to finish off this section by talking about men and men tracks, because I think that probably one of the most famous traces of them all is this moon print that was left. And that contrasts to something 3.2 million years ago that was left by Lucy, Australopithecus afarensis, where this was some of the earliest evidence that we have, 3.2 million years old, for humans walking upright. So not on all fours. I've also got an example here from Jack Nicholson, who shares my birthday and my initials. No, we're not the same year, I should hasten to add, but this is him on the Hollywood Hall of Fame, Walk of Fame. And then I put these in here because these were discovered by geophysicists. You don't need to be a paleontologist. These geophysicists went out to East Anglia expecting to look for some geophysical data, and they ended up finding these 900,000-year-old oldest European footprints somewhere in East Anglia. And then I put in these because these are handprints. I don't know how well you can see them at home, but these are handprints that are created by an indigenous person holding their hand like this and blowing paint over it and creating this handprint as well. And that really is, that's a kind of trace as well. So I don't know whether that would count as modern or ancient. It's somewhere in between. So I mentioned coprolites at the beginning, and it's rude not to actually talk about them. This is a coprolite bed that I found in the Triassic in Kananaskis, so not far away from Calgary. But we're talking briefly about coprolites. So there's a huge variety of fossil poops. They're often quite tough to identify, but not when they're like this, which is really a very clear example of a fossil turtle poop. This is a dinosaur poop sitting here, and then if you open it, then they're often agatized, so they're actually beautiful colors. And some are even spirals. Sharks in particular are very good at laying spiral poops or pooping out spiral poops. So that's how you can recognize shark tracks. Now, everyone talks about the poops, but what about wheeze? People have a lot more wheeze than poops normally, and so do animals. So this is an interpreted urolite, or a sauropod pea trace, that was found in Utah. And I wonder if I pointed out something to you in the field and said this is a pea trace, a dinosaur pea trace, you'd probably go, yeah, you're pulling my leg here. So it is a bit hard to know for sure. But there's a depression here that was filled in by sediment, and who knows? It could indeed be a sauropod peeing trace. So just to conclude, clearly the study of neoichnology is very much alive. The use of modern traces to help us to understand ancient traces, I think, is a very fun and interesting branch of science to follow. Interpreting the modern traces is great practice for interpreting ancient ones. And there are many modern traces that have not yet been identified in the fossil record. So let's get out there and try and find some of those, particularly things like fish fossils, fish traces, and vertebrate burrows. I think they're terribly underrepresented in the fossil record, and they're just there. We just haven't spotted them yet. So every time you see